What's driving 50,000 American farmers to abandon the profession that built this nation? And why are countries like Japan, Mexico, and Germany suddenly signing billion-dollar contracts with Canadian suppliers instead of their traditional American partners? The answer reveals a transformation that goes far beyond farming. It's reshaping the economic foundation of both countries in ways that will affect everything from your grocery bill to national security. The numbers are staggering, but they don't tell the whole story. Between January 2024 and June 2025, over 50,000 American farmers have either shut down operations or sold their land entirely. Texas alone lost 11,000 farms. That's more than entire states like Vermont or New Hampshire have in total. Nebraska, once a wheat export powerhouse, saw 14 counties report mass farm closures in just the first half of 2025. What's driving this unprecedented exodus? You're looking at a perfect storm that hit all at once. Immigration enforcement raids starting in early 2024 decimated the agricultural workforce. About 40% of farm laborers nationwide are immigrants, and many simply vanished overnight after surprise inspections. In Arizona, entire vegetable harvests rotted in fields because there was literally no one left to pick them. At the same time, input costs exploded. Fertilizer prices jumped 30% above 2023 levels, fuel costs soared, and in states like California, electricity for irrigation pumps increased by over 150%. Many farmers found themselves spending more to grow crops than they could earn selling them. Then climate pressures hit. Texas faced both severe drought and unexpected flooding that destroyed planting schedules. Nebraska battled a tar spot fungus outbreak that devastated corn crops across 14 counties. Arizona dealt with water restrictions so severe that farmers couldn't drill new wells even when they had the money. The final blow came from market disruptions. Export contracts worth billions were canceled as international buyers, nervous about supply chain reliability, started looking elsewhere for agricultural products. The result? Farmers who had worked the same land for generations simply walked away. But here's what's really remarkable. While America hemorrhages agricultural talent, Canada has launched the most aggressive farmer recruitment campaign in its history. Canada didn't just watch this agricultural collapse happen. They engineered a masterful response that turned America's crisis into their greatest opportunity. While U.S. farmers struggled with bureaucratic roadblocks and funding cuts, the Canadian government launched what agricultural economists are calling the most comprehensive farm support strategy in North American history. In March 2024, Ottawa rolled out the Agricultural Expansion Initiative, pumping over $3 billion into direct farmer subsidies, crop insurance programs, and equipment financing. But here's what makes it brilliant. They specifically targeted crops in regions where American production was failing. Saskatchewan received $800 million to expand wheat and canola operations. British Columbia got $600 million for greenhouse infrastructure and fruit production. The infrastructure investments are equally strategic. Canada spent $2.7 billion upgrading rail networks dedicated to agricultural transport, expanded the Port of Vancouver's grain storage capacity by 40%, and built new cold storage facilities across 3 provinces. They're not just growing more food, they're ensuring they can get it to international markets faster and cheaper than American competitors. But the real genius lies in their immigration strategy. The Agricultural Worker Pilot Program, launched in January 2025, fast-tracks permanent residency for farm workers with just 2 years of experience. They're actively recruiting not just laborers, but experienced American farmers themselves. Applications from Texas and California surged 300% in the first 6 months of 2025. The result? Canadian agricultural land prices jumped 43% in 18 months as investors and farmers alike recognize the shifting landscape. When you see the actual export numbers, the scope of Canada's agricultural surge becomes impossible to ignore. The raw export data reveals just how dramatic this agricultural power shift has become. In the second quarter of 2025 alone, Canada secured over $1.6 billion in new agricultural export contracts, a 34% increase compared to the same period in 2024. Meanwhile, U.S. agricultural exports dropped by nearly $800 million as international buyers canceled contracts or simply didn't renew them. Here's what's really striking. Canada exported 6.6 million tons of wheat in the first half of 2025. capturing market share that American suppliers held for decades. Japan, which historically bought 70% of its wheat from the U.S., now sources 45% from Canadian provinces. Mexico, once America's most reliable agricultural partner, shifted over $2 billion in purchasing contracts to Canadian suppliers after trade disputes disrupted U.S. deliveries. The price advantages Canada offers are impossible for buyers to ignore. Canadian wheat sells for an average of $12 per ton, less than comparable U.S. grain, while Canadian canola undercuts American soybean prices by nearly $20 per ton. These aren't temporary market fluctuations. They reflect Canada's lower production costs, government subsidies, and more efficient logistics networks. European Union data shows an even more dramatic shift. German and Spanish importers, traditionally loyal to American suppliers, signed contracts worth over $400 million with Canadian agricultural cooperatives in just the past 4 months. French buyers increased Canadian grain purchases by 67% year over year. But these overall export numbers only tell part of the story. When you examine what's happening in specific crop markets, wheat, corn, soybeans, and specialty agriculture, the transformation becomes even more remarkable. The grain markets tell the most dramatic story of all. Saskatchewan alone expanded its wheat production by 2.3 million acres in 2024, while Nebraska, once America's grain export champion, saw production drop by 18% in the same period. Manitoba added 1.7 million acres of corn and canola, directly competing with crops that made Iowa famous worldwide. Here's what makes Canada's grain revolution so effective. They didn't just plant more crops, they built the infrastructure to move them. The Prairie Grain Transportation Corridor, completed in March 2025, can move grain from Saskatchewan farms to Vancouver ports in 36 hours, compared to the 4 to 6 days it takes to get Nebraska wheat to export terminals. Canadian National Railway invested $800 million in dedicated agricultural rail cars and priority scheduling that guarantees delivery dates. Meanwhile, the U.S. Great Plains face a perfect storm of decline. Iowa lost 7,800 farms in 18 months. Kansas wheat production dropped 22% as farmers couldn't secure reliable labor or affordable inputs. North Dakota, once a soybean powerhouse, struggles with restricted access to Chinese markets, while Canadian provinces sign multi-year contracts with Beijing worth over $900 million. International buyers have noticed the reliability difference. When you can guarantee delivery dates, consistent quality, and stable pricing, as Canadian cooperatives now do, buyers stop taking risks on suppliers who might not deliver. Asian grain importers report that Canadian suppliers have a 97% on-time delivery rate compared to 78% for American grain exporters. But Canada's agricultural dominance isn't limited to traditional grains and staple crops. The transformation happening in fruits, vegetables, and specialty agriculture is equally dramatic and perhaps even more surprising. Who would have thought that Canada could challenge California in fruit production? British Columbia's cherry, apple, and peach yields jumped 30% in 2025 compared to the previous year, while California's Central Valley, once responsible for a quarter of America's fresh fruit, operates below break-even on 45% of its farms. The numbers seem impossible until you understand what Canada did differently. The secret lies in technology and water management. Canada invested over $1.2 billion in greenhouse infrastructure and climate-controlled growing systems across 3 provinces. Saskatchewan now operates medium-scale greenhouses for year-round production, something unthinkable just 2 years ago. These facilities use 60% less water than traditional farming, while producing crops with consistent quality regardless of weather conditions. Water gives Canada another massive advantage. While Arizona farmers face drilling restrictions and California growers pay 150% more for irrigation, Canadian provinces offer stable water access at government-subsidized rates. British Columbia's fruit farms use advanced drip irrigation systems that the provincial government subsidizes up to 75% of installation costs. The quality improvements are measurable. Canadian greenhouse tomatoes consistently grade higher than field-grown California produce, with longer shelf life and better appearance. European supermarket chains report that Canadian apples and berries arrive with less damage and spoilage than American shipments. Japanese buyers specifically request Canadian cherries, willing to pay premium prices for the consistent size and sweetness that climate-controlled growing delivers. Even more impressive, Canada achieved this diversification while solving the labor crisis that devastated American farms. The workforce stability that makes this agricultural revolution possible comes from immigration policies that treat farm workers as essential contributors rather than temporary problems. While American farms lose 40% of their workforce to immigration fears and enforcement raids, Canada solved the labor shortage with a strategy so effective it seems almost obvious in hindsight. The Agricultural Worker Pilot Program, launched in January 2025, offers permanent residency to farm workers after just 2 years of employment. No temporary status, no constant uncertainty, no fear of sudden deportation. The numbers speak for themselves. Canada processed over 47,000 agricultural worker applications in the first 6 months of 2025, with approval rates exceeding 92%. Compare that to the US H-2A visa program, where costs exceed $20,000 per worker per season and approval can take 8 months or longer. But Canada didn't stop at immigration reform. They invested $300 million in agricultural training centers across rural provinces, teaching both technical skills and English language proficiency. Workers earn $17 to $22 per hour, significantly higher than most U.S. agricultural wages, plus government-subsidized housing and healthcare benefits. The Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program expanded to include workers from 12 countries, with streamlined visa processes that guarantee return eligibility. Unlike American temporary programs that create constant workforce turnover, Canadian workers return year after year, building expertise and efficiency that shows in productivity numbers. The results are measurable. Canadian farms report 97% workforce reliability compared to 63% in comparable U.S. regions. Harvest completion rates hit 98% in Canadian provinces, while American farms struggle with 30 to 40% crop losses due to labor shortages. This labor stability didn't happen by accident. It reflects a fundamental difference in how Canadian agricultural policy approaches the relationship between government support and farming success. The policy differences between the two countries reveal why Canada's agricultural success isn't just luck. It's strategic design. While American farmers navigate a maze of conflicting regulations and funding cuts, Canada created what agricultural economists call the most farmer-friendly policy environment in North America. Take crop insurance. Canadian farmers pay premiums covering just 25 to 30% of their coverage costs, with government subsidies handling the rest. The program covers up to 90% of production losses from weather, disease, or market disruption. Meanwhile, American farmers often pay full premiums for coverage that barely reaches 60% of actual losses, if they can afford insurance at all. Environmental regulations in Canada actually support farming rather than punish it. The government offers tax credits for carbon sequestration practices, subsidizes renewable energy installations on farms, and provides grants for water conservation technology. Compare that to California, where environmental compliance costs farmers an average of $12,000 per year in additional reporting and equipment requirements. Research and development investments tell another striking story. Canada allocated $400 million to agricultural innovation in 2024, focusing on drought-resistant crops, precision farming technology, and sustainable production methods. Universities partner directly with farms for field testing, and successful innovations receive immediate scaling support from provincial governments. Perhaps most importantly, Canada maintains consistent trade policies that international buyers can count on. No sudden tariff changes, no political disputes that disrupt contracts, no uncertainty that makes long-term agreements risky. When you examine the economic data from Canadian rural communities, you can see exactly how these policy advantages translate into real prosperity and growth that American farming regions can only dream about. Rural Canadian communities are experiencing an economic boom that reverses decades of population decline and economic stagnation. Saskatchewan's rural population grew by 8% in 2024, the first significant increase since the 1970s. Young families are moving to farming towns, property values are rising, and main streets that sat empty for years now bustle with new businesses and restaurants. The transformation goes far beyond farming itself. Canada invested $2.1 billion in agricultural processing facilities across prairie provinces in 2024 alone. A new grain processing complex in Manitoba employs over 1,400 people with salaries averaging $68,000 annually. British Columbia opened 3 food processing plants that handle the province's expanded fruit and vegetable production, creating 2,700 jobs in communities that had been losing population for decades. Transportation infrastructure expansion creates another economic multiplier effect. The Prairie Grain Transportation Corridor project employed over 9,000 construction workers and continues to support 3,000 permanent logistics jobs. Port expansions in Vancouver and Montreal added 4,200 dock and warehouse positions with wages well above regional averages. Perhaps most surprising is the agricultural technology boom. Canadian ag tech companies received over $600 million in venture capital funding in 2024, double the previous year. Precision farming equipment manufacturers, greenhouse technology developers, and agricultural software companies are establishing headquarters in rural areas to stay close to their farming customers. The contrast with declining American farm towns couldn't be starker. While Canadian rural communities build new schools and hospitals, American farming regions close schools, reduce services, and watch young people leave for cities. But this agricultural transformation carries implications that reach far beyond economic statistics and rural development. It's reshaping the geopolitical balance of North America in ways that affect national security and international influence. The strategic implications of this agricultural shift extend far beyond economics. They're fundamentally altering the balance of power in North America. For the first time since World War II, the United States faces the possibility of serious food import dependency from its northern neighbor. American wheat imports from Canada increased 67% in 2024, and some U.S. food processors now rely on Canadian suppliers for ingredients they once sourced domestically. Canada's growing influence in global agricultural markets gives Ottawa new diplomatic leverage. When China imposed trade restrictions on Australian wheat in 2023, Canada stepped in to fill the gap with multi-billion-dollar contracts. European Union officials now consult Canadian agricultural ministers on global food security strategies, conversations that historically included only the U.S., Russia, and major European producers. The trade relationship dynamics are shifting in ways that would have seemed impossible just 5 years ago. Canada now holds significant leverage in NAFTA renegotiations, with American food companies dependent on reliable Canadian supply chains. Mexican buyers, frustrated with U.S. supply disruptions, signed exclusive agreements with Canadian cooperatives worth over $1 billion through 2027. National security experts are taking notice. The Pentagon's 2025 Food Security Assessment identified American agricultural decline as a strategic vulnerability, particularly given that 17% of U.S. military food procurement now comes from Canadian sources. When a country that once fed the world starts importing basic commodities from neighbors, it raises questions about long-term independence and resilience. But perhaps the most concerning aspect isn't what's happening now. It's the trajectory these trends suggest for America's agricultural future and Canada's continued expansion into markets the U.S. may never reclaim. The trajectory ahead suggests this agricultural transformation is just beginning, not ending. Agricultural economists project that another 30 to 40,000 American farmers will exit the profession by 2027 if current trends continue. The USDA's own internal assessments warn that corn production could drop 25% over the next 3 years, while wheat exports may fall below levels not seen since the 1980s. Canada, meanwhile, has unveiled expansion plans that would have seemed fantasy just 5 years ago. The National Agricultural Growth Strategy targets 50% increases in grain production capacity by 2028, supported by $14 billion in infrastructure investments. 3 new deepwater ports are planned for the Atlantic coast to serve European markets, while Pacific Coast facilities will triple their grain handling capacity. The global food system implications are staggering. If Canada captures just half the market share that American agriculture is losing, they'll become the world's second largest grain exporter, behind only Russia. European food security strategies now include Canada as a primary supplier rather than a backup option. Asian markets that relied on American agricultural imports for 7 decades are signing 20-year contracts with Canadian provinces. Perhaps most telling, investment patterns show where smart money believes the future lies. Foreign agricultural investment in Canada jumped 400% in 2024, while American farmland values stagnated or declined in major producing regions. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and agricultural giants are betting billions on Canada's continued expansion. The question isn't whether this shift will continue. The momentum is already unstoppable. The question is whether America will find a way to reverse the exodus of 50,000 farmers, or if the country that once fed the world will become dependent on others to feed itself.